During the second half of the 1900s, we begin to see a rise in political polarization alongside economic inequality. What we lack is a public awareness of this event. So let's dive into this issue briefly. This presentation will be broken down into 3 sections: a what, so what, and now what about this issue. So let's start off with what is polarization. In political terms, it is seen as the divergence of political attitudes to ideological extremes. In other words, it is the further separation of the two parties in Congress. A few other definitions before we go any further are going to be gerrymandering, which is manipulating the boundaries of an electoral constituency so as to favor one party or class. Then filibuster, an action such as a prolonged speech that obstructs progress in a legislative assembly while not technically contravening the required procedures. And then the Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality of a distribution on a scale between 0 and 1. 0 being perfect equality and 1 being perfect inequality. This graph is showing income inequality and political polarization. The blue line shows the Gini index and how it has slowly been rising from 1947 until 2007 and into the future in an upward fashion, right alongside House polarization, which is the red line, which shows a nearly identical trend, which means they are positively correlated. This demonstrates that higher income inequality leads to higher polarization directly in Congress. Political polarization can be attributed to 3 crucial factors: the amount of voters that participate in elections, as well as the type of voters that come to those elections, parties choosing to embrace free market capitalism, and finally the influence of the upper class in politics. All 3 of these together lead to inequality. First, let us start with voter turnout. This graph is showing the voter turnout rate in both 2008 and 2010 broken down by household income. The black represents non-voters, while the brown represents voters, and the tan represents non-citizens of the United States that live here currently. There are 2 main takeaways that can be seen by this graph. Non-citizens are overwhelmingly poor and cannot vote, while other poor households can't afford to vote, whether it be for reasons of involving work or family, or other things that stop them from getting to the polls. So the majority of voters turn out to be older upper-class Americans with high incomes. This only furthers the gap in polarization, because this class is more likely to lean towards the extremes, the political parties, and feel the need to elect representatives that will strongly push their specific agenda for that party. Next on the list is the influence of the upper class. Alongside the strength in voting numbers, the upper class has the power and resources to influence campaign contributions, lobbying, as well as electoral, legislative, and regulatory processes. While the influence may not always be extremely evident, it is shown that the large contributions have had the power to impact policies. This becomes even more disturbing when it is shown that the top 0.01% of Americans make up over 40% of campaign contributions. Alongside that, contributions below $500 are not even tracked because they are considered too low of an amount. To give an example of donations given by the top 0.01%, let us take the top 2 donations, which were given by Sheldon Miriam Adelson. They were $56.8 million and $46.6 million respectively. Finally, the last focus and cause of polarization is the inherent shift toward laissez-faire economics, which is the idea that the government should not interfere with the market. This is better known as free market capitalism. This can be highlighted in one very specific case. After the New Deal, we begin to see a fade towards the right by both parties, maintaining their distance but becoming more conservative. This movement towards the right allowed for the abolition of the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banks from investment banks. Originally, the Glass-Steagall Act was passed in order to stop bank runs, which are when large amounts of consumers remove their money entirely from banks because they are concerned about the bank's solvency. This act was also made to improve the consumer confidence in the bank. This act was not only made to improve the consumer confidence in banks, but also to cut ties between commercial and investment banks, which was speculated to be the cause of the 1929 market crash. So after hearing what polarization is and what its causes are, we must ask ourselves, why do we care? I would like to highlight 4 major issues caused by polarization in Congress. The first 2 issues, bureaucratic drift and policy drift, are interconnected. Bureaucratic drifts are the tendencies for bureaucratic agencies to create policies that allow them to deviate from what was originally mandated for them. This alongside policy drifts, which is the act of changing policy in order to break down the legitimacy of it, as well as to create confusing language and self-contradictory statements within the policy to lessen its importance and create loopholes for these bureaucrats to use. This can ultimately break down important policies that are set in place to regulate the market. Polarization also leads to bad and generally rushed legislation. Simply because the Senate favors the minority with only 41 votes needed to shut down legislation. This forces parties to push legislation through without discussion while there is a majority in order to pass bills that benefit a specific party. The final reason why we should care about polarization is probably the most important, and that is gridlock. Much like in this cartoon, Congress comes to an abrupt and long halt, with neither side willing to compromise. This slows down the progress of crucial bills and also can result in the shutdown of government, much like in October of 2013. This graph shows House ideology, separating Republicans and Democrats obviously in blue and Republicans in red, and showing how progressive they are while voting on specific bills. As you can see, Republicans almost always vote conservatively. At a closer look, they barely deviate from the line except for a few outliers, which shows that while Democrats are more willing to vote by the influence of the body of people that they are representing, Republicans are more apt to vote conservatively every time in order to create a standstill or gridlock within Congress or the House. So what can we do to change things? Sadly, this is the hardest part. There's nothing we can do, immediately at least. As long as the majority of lower-class Americans remain non-voters, we cannot enact the democratic will necessary in order to change policy and those who are enacting that policy. We must demand reform of the system in a peaceful way and insist it through electing in more moderately positioned politicians. This will allow for more talking over the aisle and allow for the passing of fair and well-reviewed laws through compromise. However, until that point, we will be stuck in the same cycle of poor legislative power that we are currently in.